workshop presentation workshop on using stakeholder mapping to identify pathways to influence. I am the monitoring, evaluation and learning manager at IDS. I sit within a cluster called KIP, the Knowledge, Impact and Policy cluster. We were previously a team but have been made a research cluster in our own rights to reflect the sort of growing importance of our work around evidence and evidence-informed policy. So a lot of this work that I'm going to share with you today is very focused on sort of pathways to influencing policy, but that's the context that we use it in IDS. But I draw heavily on theory of change. So, you know, a lot of these ideas around stakeholders are really key in all areas of development work. We've got quite a lot to go through. I would encourage you to use the chat. We've got about 15 people at the moment, possibly some late arrivals. So put your hands up, use the chat. I'm monitoring both if you've got any questions. The structure that we're going to have is I'm going to talk at you a little bit, explain a little bit of the sort of conceptual background, and then give you my very favorite facilitation tool. Then we're gonna put you in breakout groups. I've got a parallel supporting mural. I'll talk you through that if you haven't used that in the past. Then you've got sort of 20 minutes to touch and feel the exercise. Michelle has shared with you a very brief mock-up scenario that I developed last night. It came entirely out of my own head and is sort of I meant it to be vague because I want you to input from your own experiences and think about different stakeholder groups. You know, this is very much just a flavor. Then we'll come back from that. We'll have a bit more talking about some other activities and exercises for stakeholder mapping. Then you'll have another chance to work in your groups on another exercise, and then we'll come back and wrap it up. So please ask me questions throughout. And I don't need to rush off at the end if you've got a burning question that we don't get to. So, and I've got a bit of a. Okay, so I am going to start over here. Continue. So I'm just going to skip that because I've just said that. So essentially, we're starting off with some of the sort of framing of stakeholder mapping, and this is I've got a few slides on just how I think about this stuff. This is my absolute go-to in all the complexity in all the projects that I work on. I just keep coming back to this slide of the spheres of control, influence, and interest. This comes sort of out of a methodology called outcome mapping, that some of you may be familiar with, that really talks about when we're designing development projects, these three spheres of control, of influence, and interest. For the work that I do in monitoring and evaluation, that sort of we talk about a lot about outputs and output level reporting and output indicators as opposed to outcome indicators. There is no sort of set line between what becomes an output and what becomes an outcome. But really, so this idea of the sphere of control, the things that are in our control. So when we get development funding, we can deliver trainings, we can write papers, we can run meetings, we can do that, we can control it, we can say we'll do 5, we'll do 5. As we move out to this sort of sphere of influence, this is a really interesting area. This is where change happens, and this is where the stakeholders are really, really key, because this is we do all those things. We run our trainings, we write our papers or our training manuals, we run our meetings because we want to shift behaviors in our different stakeholder groups, and therefore stakeholder mapping is really important to know who those people are, but also what the dynamics are between them and the changes that we hope to see. And so that's the focus today. And then this sort of broader sphere of interest, I try to stay away from. That's sort of our framing. In a lot of the projects we see, that's the sort of the sustainable development goals, but there's no way that we can ever show that from our small project we have made any level of sort of a dent in these sustainable development goals. But it provides this sort of overarching framework. We're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to improve livelihoods. We're trying to improve educational outcomes. But once we get into that gets into the sort of very complex evaluation sphere that, you know, we've got lots of colleagues that work on that, but that's not my area of expertise. What for me, and you know, what we track and what we try to understand is this sphere of influence. You know, who are we reaching, who changes, and how. Another model that we use a lot at IDS, this has come out of the ESRC, the Economic Social Research Council, is thinking about impact in terms of these 4 dimensions. And a lot of the work that we do specifically is about instrumental impact. It's about research influencing policy. But prior to IDS, I worked for Oxfam, I worked for ActionAid, and that was much more about sort of supporting communities to, you know, to have influence. We did a lot of work on advocacy, which also links to the policy, but also a lot of work around sort of developing sort of what is that really, that tangible change in policy or practice. And that's really quite hard and really often very ambitious. So we work around these other areas of the wheel, the conceptual, which is really about changing how people approach a problem, changing ways of thinking, which is obviously very linked to stakeholders. The idea of building capacity and developing new skills and capabilities, again, that's changes in people and stakeholder groups. And the networks and connectivity, which I could do a whole other workshop on, is about the relationships between those groups. And we'll touch on that a little bit today, but essentially, you know, change doesn't happen. These sort of broader systemic change, the change in the sphere of interest, is a result of sort of incremental changes in different stakeholder groups. And the first exercise we'll do today is, you know, they pull against each other. Some people are on board, other people may be resisting. So, you know, building those networks is a key strategy to sort of move your stakeholder groups forward together. And then just finally on the conceptual stuff, thinking about the theory of change, which I think, you know, as this group has sort of relatively recently graduated development professionals, that, you know, the sort of skills and thinking around developing a theory of change, you know, that's what I do. I've made my career out of this. But that sort of stepping stones of what are we trying to achieve with this project? So we'll share the presentation with you afterwards, but I've written a couple of sort of resource guides to, you know, using theory of change, developing log frames, developing MEL frameworks, which is, you know, what we do to support the research projects at IDS, but sort of previously working for projects in Oxfam and ActionAid. And this idea of, you know, developing this vision, the vision of change, which is associated with, you know, the sphere of interest, this sort of high level goal. That's the direction that the program is heading. It gives you a sort of a framing, and then understanding the context dynamics, step 3. And again, this is where the stakeholders come in. You know, we need to know the context that we're working in, and that is about the institutions that are active in the space, whether that's geographically or thematically. But, you know, the work we do is really, you know, IDS is sort of social research, but even, you know, the sort of harder research, it's changes about people. So understanding that context dynamic, and then thinking about, well, how do we, you know, what is our pathway to change? Well, our pathway to change is through these sort of, you know, building up capacities of groups, building up networks of groups, shifting the conceptual understanding of groups. That's going to provide the foundations to these sort of higher level instrumental impacts of shifting policy or sort of funding frameworks and moving funding in that direction. So we'll come back to the theory of change and a little bit this sort of idea of mapping causal pathways, of having a plan, and what do we think those stepping stones are from the sphere of control to the sphere of influence to the sphere of interest, and what are some of the assumptions that we are making along that pathway. So I think that's my sort of theory, conceptual stuff. So now we come to stakeholders, and this, we talk about stakeholders is this like generic term for everyone, everywhere, ever. And so part of stakeholder mapping is breaking that down, and the tools that I'm going to share with you today give you sort of different angles on that. But essentially, when we're designing development projects, there's, we need to think about who are the key partners. And that's usually quite, not necessarily straightforward, but who is the partner that is going to be most sort of relevant in this context, and then who are the audiences beyond that. So who are the other people that have a stake? So that's likely things like local authorities, maybe sort of national government, people working in ministries. It would be sort of other groups or networks working on similar thematic areas. So they're not your immediate partners, but they're people that are also active in this space that you necessarily need to engage with. You can't sort of run a project and ignore what's happening around you and who else is in this space. And then you've got that sort of end user, and because at IDS we work, we have a very strong policy focus. So those sort of end users, there's a bit of a kickback on beneficiaries as too colonial, but the people that will become that will be influenced, whose lives will be improved through this new policy. When I was with the NGOs, with Oxfam, we work much more directly with those community groups, working with them to sort of empower them to work with authorities and negotiate for their rights. So it's just really clear, and these may overlap. You may have a partner, and that those are these. None of these categories are sort of set in stone. They're just sort of ways of breaking down this complex reality, and looking at it in different ways. And something else to think about is, stakeholders, they work at different levels. So in the example that we're going to look at, I've sort of purposefully thrown you the local and the national and the international, but I mean that's the reality of a lot of projects, specifically large projects, is they will have ambitions to influence change at those three levels. And one of the assumptions that I see and push back on all the time in project design is this assumption that because we've done a really good job at the community level, the national level policymakers will just go, oh, this is great, let's change the policy, when actually there's very little engagement between those two levels. And the same with the global, or we're doing really strong global advocacy and a really strong community component, but they're actually essentially sort of the two different pathways, but are they in fact two different projects? And this idea of stakeholder, the stakeholders are stakeholders because they've got a stake. People don't come to this as neutral parties waiting to be led by you. They've got their own strategies, they've got their own interests. In the work I did with ActionAid, we worked on tax and land, and there was very, very powerful counter lobby groups that they don't want you to move forward. They may sort of befriend you, but there'll be strategies there. So being really aware of those dynamics, and really this sort of power dynamics. And we're super conscious, and specifically at IDS, of we work a lot directly on power. We're very conscious of our own power in our relationship with our partners. And we do everything to sort of try and make those power relations as equal as possible. But working between different groups, there will be power structures, and coming in as a development agency, you may not necessarily be aware of them, or they may not be, they may be not necessarily be on the surface. Right, there's nothing in the chat, no burning questions. Great. It's obviously all very clear. So we will come back to the idea of assumptions, but I think it's useful. It's really useful to plant them at this stage in your thinking, in terms of so stakeholder mapping is essentially stakeholder mapping is, on the one hand, it's about identifying the terrain, who is there in the context in which we're going to work, and then doing that to strategize how are we going to work with them. And this, the work that we do specifically in my team, the Knowledge, Impact and Policy, we do a lot of engagement activities, social media, big policy events, all sorts of, all whole range of activities. And it's all about getting information to people to try to sort of shift those attitudes, shift that conceptual understanding, build their capacities, strengthen their relationships. So, when you're thinking about designing any sort of intervention, it's like, so who do we think needs to change? What is their role? What do we expect them to do? And who do you expect them to work with? So the outcome mapping methodology that I mentioned earlier has this great concept of your boundary partners. They're the people in your direct sphere of control, but they have their boundary partners. So, what's the knock-on effect if we can change the sort of policies or programs of this large development agency? Then that will have a knock-on effect further down the line. But just thinking, about how people will engage. What's your stakeholders? Different stakeholders will engage in different ways. If you're going to work with community groups and government officials, you're probably going to frame that in different ways. There'll be a way of, there'll be a need to bring those groups together. And what is it that, the actions? So that, once we enter into this sphere of working with stakeholders and thinking about the changes we want to see, we automatically enter into this realm of assumptions. And we'll come back to that at the end of the session. Oh, why am I not moving forward? Okay, so I'm only slightly behind time, which is great. I'm trying to give you as much active time in your groups as possible. So this idea, when I showed you the sort of the third step in the theory of change, understanding context dynamics, is really about, I talk a lot about, okay, so we're going and we've got this plan, this is what we want to do, and let's try and look at the context from as many different dimensions as we can. So let's look at it this way, and then let's look at it that way, and let's look at it that way. And all of these tools that I'm about to present just give you a different entry point to look at your reality. None of them give you that's the definitive picture. And because of that, there's no sort of right or wrong. What these tools are for is to have that conversation. So your key groups, your partners, you may see the project in one way, but your partner who's on the ground, or your partner who's in one country and your partner who's in another country, who are going to replicate, that they may approach the problem in very, very different ways. So these tools are really about having a conversation. It's less about getting to it's the process rather than the product that I would emphasize here. I'm not going to talk too much about the problem tree analysis, but you can follow up on that. But this essentially is a dynamic that we do, and thinking about, what is the problem that we're trying to address, and what are some of the root causes of those dynamics. And that's really, that's sort of our entry point to think about, what is it specifically that we want to change, and therefore who needs to go into those groups. But my favorite, I have to be honest with you, that I find the problem tree, it's very knotty. It's quite a challenge to facilitate. That, what's a cause and what's an effect. You can split hairs, and but the key is to get people thinking. It's always a useful exercise to do, but generates more questions than answers. So these next two tools, well, you're going to have a crack at the alignment interest matrix, which is a very straightforward tool, but always generates so much discussion, and it's just a really, really rich starting point to think about stakeholder mapping, and I'll talk you through that, and then network mapping, which is sort of my personal favorite. Because that's what I did my PhD on, is sort of looking at then the relationships. So once we've identified who different stakeholders are and what their alignment there, there's a sort of perspective on power that's to do with, how influential are these people in this space. But then network mapping gives you a different perspective on power. It looks at the relational aspect of power in terms of, well, you could have drawing on sort of my Oxfam days of working with the big gas company, is very, very powerful compared to the community. But actually you could have some really strong players who are networked and control those relationships, and there's quite a lot of power there. So that the network mapping helps with that insight. So this is the alignment influence matrix, and this is the interface that you're going to see in Mural. I'm hoping that people are familiar with Mural, but if you're not, it's very straightforward, and are useful in this day that we're now in this age where we're now doing everything virtually. These are sort of really handy tools for facilitation, and over the last 18 months we've been forced to do a lot of theory of change facilitation online, and it's worked really well. Actually, we've it's sort of been quite revolutionary, using this Mural, or Miro is another similar. So essentially what I'm going to give you a link to take you to the Mural. In fact, maybe I can do that. Michelle, have you got that link? Could you put it in the chat, so that we can make sure everyone's in before we go into the breakout groups? I'm going to see. If not, I can grab it. You got it?
You should see it in the chat now.
Okay, yeah, well done, thank you. So this is a Mural board. I should see you start to come in with your spirit animals. Yep, seeing people arriving. So if you can't get in, you have any problems, let us know, because when we go into the breakout groups, that's where all the action is going to be. And you'll see we've got 2 exercises. So when you go in the group, I think we've got 17 people, so I don't think we need 6 groups, probably. So there's 3 of us, say 3 groups, 4 groups. My maths is, I'll let you, 4 groups, 3 groups of, yeah. 4 groups of 3. 4 groups is, the smaller the number, the more people have to participate. But hopefully that means everyone needs to pay attention, or actually be online. So what we're doing, we've got this matrix: strong influence, strong alignment. Those are your potential partners. You've got strong alignment but weak influence. So these are people that you think, yeah, they're really on board. They've got the same vision as us, but how can we work with them? They're not. They're a local level NGO and they don't have any connections. Or so that's that sort of bottom blue matrix. That sort of top left yellow matrix, people who are very, very influential but weakly aligned. So for example, when in Oxfam, when we were working with the oil and gas companies, so powerful, but their interest was so far from what we were trying to do to support the communities. And then this sort of red bottom right quadrant of people that they're not influential, they're not aligned, and really, the question is always, do we have the budget to then worry about them? But it's important to keep an eye, because situations change. So we are just, now I've got so what you're going to end up with, we're about to go into breakout groups for about 20 minutes. Michelle has sent you through my mock-up project, which is a little bit complex, I have to admit, but that's the reality. I don't think I've ever come across a simple project. So, you know, I didn't want to make it, I didn't, you know, and again, this is about giving you a chance to touch and feel the tools. If you haven't used Mural before, it's a chance to explore how that works, because it is really, really useful. And so what we do, you're going to go into your groups and you're going to, based upon the case study, just because it gives everyone a common reference point, and have a think about, okay, so who in this project are the key stakeholders, and where do they sit on the alignment influence matrix? You know, are they, the colors was quite useful. Don't need to worry about that. When you click on Mural, you can change the colors, but don't worry too much about the colors. It's the matrix. If we were in a workshop setting, you'd all have different color post-it notes, and that really doesn't matter. But it's where people sit, and you should be able to drag you can click to create stickies, and you should be able to drag those around. But again, the focus is really on the conversation. So are there any questions? Is anyone unclear? Is everyone there? Is anyone there? Okay, so we've got 60. Okay, I've got some thumbs up. Thank you. Yes, it's clear. So 16, let's do the maths. 3 of us, so that's 13.
Yeah, we've made 3 breakout rooms.
Okay.
I thought that was clearest. So yeah, 3 breakout rooms. So there should be 4 or 5 people in each one.
Okay, perfect. And you'll see we've got lots of space. So, but I've given sort of group 1, group 2, group 3. But basically, you're intelligent people. Find a space where no one else is working. You're all on the same mural board, but you're in your breakout group. You can have focus in. You can scroll in and scroll out, so you can just focus on your part of the mural and ignore what everyone else is doing in the other groups. Or you can go and have a sneaky look, but you know. Right, Molly, if there are no questions, press the magic button. I'll be jumping between groups, so see you. We've got 20 minutes, sorry. Okay, so you've now all done a mural that looks exactly like this one, sort of. So I'm going to move to the next slide. I've lost my control panel. There we go. So, we've done all that. So I'm going to talk briefly about network mapping because I love it.
Louise, I don't know if you know, but we're looking at your presenter view, and I don't know whether that's what you meant for us to look at.
No, it's not. Hold on a moment. Stop. You are sharing. Stop share. We did discuss this before the workshop. Screen, that one. That's the one you want. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So what I do is, once we've done this massive brainstorm of who are the key stakeholders, and it's, you know, at this first stage, it's let's go really broad. Then think about, well, what's their relationships? And I think this gives another perspective on power and also our own role. Where do we fit in this context? And you know, I'm a strong believer that it's about networks and relationships. As a development agency, it's about how effective you are at building relationships. That is really a key indicator of the success of your project, but also around building relationships between different groups. So, you know, this example that I've mocked up of is essentially, it's about creating connections. It's creating connections between different ethnic groups. It's about creating connections between peace building and natural resource management specialists. You know, it's about creating connections between sort of the local and the national and the international level. So that's all about creating relationships and connections. And that, again, that's, what are those connections? Well, they're between, and they're actually, they may look like they're between institutions, but the work you do will be connecting people. And so again, it's all about, on the one hand, we're mapping, but on the other hand, that's sort of helping us to strategize. Where are the potential alliances? Where are the potential tensions? You know, who works with who already? You know, if we work with this partner, they're already connected to this whole network over here. If we work with this partner, we're not. You know, so it gives you, they may, that partner, that second partner may look very powerful, but actually when you see that, oh, that opens that door to hold that whole community, you know, all those community groups. So it's just another perspective. Controls. And for me, this is very much around when we map networks, and, you know, doing it in a workshop setting, it's very much, you know, who are the people or institutions, what are the relationships, but what's that structure? You know, are we going into, you know, if you're taking the example, is the Eastern region really cohesive? And actually there's a lot of networks and people are already coordinating, and then we go to the West and it looks very different. There are much, you know, there are far fewer agencies, there are far fewer connections, everyone's working in their own siloed bubble, and your strategy would look quite different. In that case, you know, it may be about bringing people together. You know, in the Eastern region, what is it? What is your specific role? So understanding that structure, and also, you know, what does success look like? What will it, you know, what do we want to change? Who do we want to connect to who, to make this work? I'm not going to go into sort of the ins and outs of stakeholder mapping. It's quite hard. I've struggled to do it on Mural, I have to admit. It's great fun in a workshop where you just get a big flip chart and pens and stick people, and, you know, what are the relationships? But again, it's, you know, we usually take the stickies off the alignment influence matrix. I make people write them out again because I like, but then, and then stick them on here and move them all around. Who's connected to who? What are the different relationships? You know, are they, you know, finding how does information flow? How is finance flowing? How are resources? You know, I did a lot of work in my early career around value chains and products flowing, and you know, where is the power? And there's, you know, one group was discussing, well, what do we mean by influence? And, you know, there are many different dimensions of power, and I'm sure you've all come across the work of John Gaventa after your time at IDS, but, you know, thinking about where is it that we sit? You know, are we established? Are we coming in new? When I was in Bolivia with my PhD, actually people received this really well, that we came in and we looked at who was there first, and then we called them all together for a meeting and said, right, what's our role here? And they, you know, they were like, okay, well, this is what we need from you, rather than here we are, we've arrived, we're doing this. So that, again, that understanding is really important for project design. But then this point, so that's sort of my understanding, the mapping part of the stakeholder analysis. But then the change part is like really, you know, who needs to be doing what differently. And again, we've got a few different models. I worked for a long time with this idea of knowledge, attitudes, and practice, and I think this links to the you know, the wheel of impact that we use at IDS. The sort of the knowledge is this sort of conceptual, or the knowledge is the capacities, the attitudes is this conceptual, how I think about a problem, and the practice is what they actually do differently. And, you know, I saw this a lot in my time with the NGOs, is, you know, we run loads of training courses, you know, training workshops, train people, and the world will be a better place. But actually, you weren't shifting attitudes. People weren't sort of applying these skills because we couldn't, you know, it was hard to create those opportunities, which leads us on to, so this, I use this for a long time, but then this idea of like, well, what is the space where people apply those skills? I'm just I'll come back to that. So something that we use a lot now at IDS is coming out of the behavior change wheel. I'll leave that reference there. I'm not going to go into it because the part of it that we use is what we call the COM-B model. And this is around, it's taking this idea, it takes that idea of knowledge, attitude, practice one step further by introducing this idea of the opportunity. So in order to change behavior and give, that essentially that is someone is doing something differently than they were before, that's linked to your project vision. And that is, we think of that as a combination of the capabilities. So, your skills, your sort of awareness, your motivation, which is I link it strongly to attitude. I have a positive attitude towards this issue. I believe that I can make a difference. But this really crucial piece of opportunity, I saw this, a great project I worked with in Mexico, and they were training nurses. But then the nurses were trained in all these new skills, and they went back and the doctors wouldn't let them apply them. So this idea of that you need to create those opportunities, in the example that we're working with, what will be the opportunity for different groups to engage, and what different skills will that entail. So again, this is another exercise that sort of use. You can all see the mural, so you know what's coming next. But just again, so the idea now is we're going to go back into the mural. As I say, previously I would have done a 2-day workshop using, so this would take up half a morning. You're going to get 15 minutes, so it's very, very false. But the hope with this workshop is that we just give you a taster. We give you some ideas and tools that you can take away and think about how they apply in your work. So we're going to go, in the interest of time, we're going to go back into the same groups, just because you've had a preliminary conversation. And what I want you to do next is think about,
Louise,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but sadly, when I had to recreate the breakout rooms when they ended, the groups are different.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you're not going in the same breakout groups. You're going completely different breakout groups. That's great. You get to talk to new people. Perfect. No worries, Molly.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. We adapt and we innovate in the Mel world. It's fine. So you're going to go into different breakout groups. You choose one actor. We're going to have 15 minutes. Choose one person and think about, okay, what is the behavior change that we want to see, and therefore what are some of the capabilities that actor needs? What are some of what will motivate, and this links in with the the alignment. People are they if they're not aligned, what will motivate them to sort of engage with the project, and what are the opportunities for them to do, for them to behave differently. This is quite complex, so and 15 minutes is not enough. So I apologize for that, but I'd rather you were amazing throwing it at the deep end with the mural, and I'd rather give you a taste to take away and question than just talk at you theoretically. So we got 15 minutes. This is a real whistle stop tour of stakeholder mapping. Molly, I'll stop talking. Press the button, please. This is a really challenging exercise in the real world when you know your partners and you're not making it up and you've got an hour and not 15 minutes. So I'm sorry that that felt a bit overwhelming. It was, but this is an exercise that we use and we use a lot. So again, I just wanted to give you a taster and some ways of thinking about this. I don't think I'll need to, yeah, there's a guy called John Main who's written a lot about COM-B, which I don't think the link is in my presentation, but look it up, and this is very much our thinking around developing theory of change. Right, I've got a few more slides, probably too many for 10 minutes. Does anyone want to jump in with some questions while I sort my screen out? No, I'm shocked silence. But as I said, we do use this. This is the real deal.
Well, in our group, Ana
Mhm.
Paula was, well, I don't know if Ana Paula wants to pop in, but she was like identifying how capability, motivation, opportunity were all intertwined. And I also believe it has a lot to do also with incentives. Incentives create also, are connected with these behavioral changes and motivation, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And I just sort of want to run through, and I think this idea of motivation, incentive, and also the opportunity piece is this is where a lot of the assumptions come in that we make, and the exercise I gave you was very complex and really embedded power issues that you've all touched upon, and you're not going to solve those with an exercise like this, but you are going, the fact that we're like, well, we're just thinking about this, and we're digging into some of these issues, some of the complexity. That's what these exercises are for. They're not, there's no, here you go, you feed the information and your perfect strategy comes out the other side. Ideally they'd be done with your partners. It's that reflecting, again, it's the process that has the value, sort of more than the product with all of these. I end up with flip charts, and then what do we do? But actually we've got people on the same page. I'm gonna have to go fast. So then this sort of idea of bringing it all together, and this is where we get to that sort of latter part of the theory of change, of thinking around causal assumptions. I'm going to pass this. There's a paper I wrote, bit of a self plug, around trying to apply COM-B to thinking around policy influencing. And again, it all comes back to stakeholders and how we're sort of building this sense of ownership, working, not just how we understand the problem, but how the different groups that we're working with understand the problem, that they, build this sort of sense of shared ownership, shared, the sort of, shared ownership of this journey, particularly in this context where we were talking about people giving up their land, that needs a very it's a very long term, but some you require some quite subtle shifts to get to move that ship in that direction. Anyway, you can follow up if that's interesting, but this idea of sort of mapping. So then once we've done, okay, I do these workshops and we spend a day and a half and we've done all these flip charts and we've got all this complexity in actors and their relationships and their behaviors, and then what do we do with it? At some point we have to sort of then pin it down, this idea of, well, what is the pathway? Are we focusing on building, sort of shifting attitudes? Are we focusing on building capacities? So what we're, the design of what we're going to do, maybe with one group, actually it is about building capacities and capabilities, whereas with another, it's much more sort of building their sense of ownership. It's such a sort of much more about sort of engagement, building sort of shifting attitudes, a sort of conceptual understanding, and well, what is your strategy to deliver that once having realized its importance. And that idea of then, once we're taking these pathways, and I think Marisol, you just sort of hit the nail on the head, this this aha moment of, well, we need to change people's minds. If they're not on board, this is not, we can do a great project and people can come to our meetings, but the moment that we write our final report, everything goes back to how it was before. So what is the longevity here, and so what are the assumptions we're making around how people will engage with our project? And I think that the capabilities, opportunities, motivation, while it's sort of quite fiddly, but it's when this, I used to do it with the CAP, and think when we talked about those attitudes, that was where the project teams would have this massive aha moment of, oh, but what we're doing is not enough, and it's not ever going to be enough. And having that that in your sort of planted in you from the moment of sort of your initial stakeholder engagement is really, really critical. It's going to, you know, it makes a huge difference in terms of sort of really clearly articulating your assumptions. And this is my last slide. And I can't do a presentation without putting the assumptions guy in. And for me, this idea of assumptions is quite tricky, but once you get going with it, then everything's an assumption. In my life, everything's an assumption. I don't know when. So when we go from the sphere of control to the sphere of influence, we're making an assumption. We're making an assumption how our stakeholders will engage. We're making an assumption about their motivations. We're making an assumption that, you know, by working with this specific group of stakeholders, that change will happen. So those are our sort of what we call causal assumptions, that we talk about the if we do this, then that will happen. We don't know that. We make, you know, so, and I talk about this with projects, it's like, this is our get out of jail. It's like, we don't know how change happens. But if it's better that we say we don't know, then our evaluator or our funder says, well, this isn't clear and you haven't thought this through. So this is a way of framing, you know, this is we've defined this path to our change. We're working with these stakeholders, and we're making this series of assumptions, and by really sort of clearly articulating those assumptions, provides you with okay, well, we need to keep coming back to this. We need to keep, you know, sort of reflecting our stakeholders behaving in this way, our assumptions about their incentives and what motivates them holding. And I think, you know, that's really where there's a lot of richness. And you know, for me as a you know, I'm the monitoring, evaluation and learning person. You know, it used to be M&E, it was just monitoring and evaluation. And I think what theory of change has really opened up these projects are about learning, and the learning is sort of, I tie it to the assumptions. We don't know how change happens, so that's an opportunity for us to learn. By engaging with this group in this way, we're learning. We may not achieve that influence that we've, you know, that we've got evidence that they've done this specific, you know, proving behavior change is hard, but we can demonstrate our learning. And then you know, there's this other sort of level of assumptions, which are the context assumptions. You know, we assume there won't be a global pandemic and we can't get on a plane ever again. That assumption actually didn't hold. You know, we assume that our project won't get cut by unfortunately for many people, that assumption didn't hold. So, but there are things that's like the ground that the project is built on. We make assumptions there. But what's more interesting is that the sort of the causal assumptions, in terms of, again, moving back, bring it back to the sphere of control, to the sphere of influence. Every time you're jumping, you're making an assumption. And to sort of just final conclusions, whenever we're working with a stakeholder group, we're making an assumption. So, and that's, you know, and the theory of change thinking actively encourage us to make assumptions, which is a real positive. You know, we don't have to say this is you know, this is hard, fast truth. This is what my project is going to achieve. You say, this is what my project hopes to achieve by working with these set of stakeholders, and these are my assumptions of you know, how change will happen in this group, and where I can, just to sort of finalize, you know, when I talk about outcomes and we know what we hope we'll see in this sphere of influence, I try and structure that around the stakeholders. So, you know, in the example, well, in landowners, we'll see sort of a positive shift towards land sharing. In community groups, we'll see a positive, you know, we'll see new capabilities around negotiation and natural resource management. In local authorities, we'll see new sort of new policies towards more equitable land reform. You know, those are examples, but, you know, so I find it very, very useful to think about those stakeholders and say, right, change for this group looks like this, and that's what we're trying to achieve with this project. So, and that's the end from me, I think. Oh, and then there's some really useful resources. And that's the end from me. I have not left any space for questions. I haven't bamboozled you. I can stay for a few minutes longer if anyone's got any burning questions. I hope I haven't scared you off. The mural space will be open, so if you want to come back in after the workshop, there are some empty boxes there. So if you think, well, I wonder what this looks like for this project that I'm working on, go in, find a space. You know, you've got the tools, and that was a taster, and hopefully as you move forward in your careers, you'll come back and say, now I can see where that might add value, and that might be a useful facilitation tool. So that's I'm just trying to find the chat box. I'm going to stop share. Anything in the chat? Oh, lots in the chat. Thank you. Great, and you're all expert muralists as well now. A bonus skill. Okay. No burning questions. Good luck. Happy stakeholder mapping. And I hope that you'll find opportunities to apply these tools in your work one day.
Thank you. I was wondering, is there any chance for us to have this presentation?
Yeah, I've sent it to Michelle. I'll put the John Main reference in, and I'll well, actually, you've got the link. Just let me put a reference into the Combi paper, and then I'll ping Michelle to share it with you all. But yes, we'll share the slides with you.
Thank you so much. It was super interesting.